Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. Today we have a special guest. His name is Gleb. He hails from Los Altos, California. And what we're going to do for Gleb today is we are going to do a rear axle seal and bearing job on his 100 series Land Cruiser, which would be the same job you would be doing on a Lexus LX470. There are several ways you could discover a problem with your rear axle. You could discover gear oil leak from your rear axle, letting you know your seal failed. It could be a situation where you start hearing some noise from your rear end and you've determined it's play in one or both of the bearings. So there's a few different ways you could determine that this is a job you're going to need to do. If you're familiar with our channel, you know we have done a lot of rear axle seal and bearing jobs on Toyota and Lexus SUVs and trucks. We haven't yet done one on a 100 series Land Cruiser or a LX470, so that's the reason why we are making this video. For this video, I am of course going to use my favorite tool builder for Toyota and Lexus rear axle seal jobs, and that's my buddy Duane, who hails from Omaha, Nebraska. He builds the tools at his house, made in the USA. So let's show you what those tools look like. So here's the tool set. You have this main tool that's going to be used at every single step of the process. This tool right here is going to be used to pull off the ABS tone ring and inner retainer. It's going to marry up with the main tool. Once we get the inner retainer and ABS tone ring off, then we're going to get this plate in place on the backing plate, and again married up with the main tool so we can press the axle through the bearing. And then what ends up happening with this job is one of the bearing races is going to get stuck on the axle, and Duane sells this tool as an addition to the basic kit, and this tool will be used to pull off the race that was stuck on the axle. It comes with this large round plate. This is going to be used to put up on top of the axle when we're driving the axle into the new bearing. It comes with this smaller round plate, and this is going to be used to drive the new bearing into the bearing case. And then finally, it comes with these two tools, and these will be used to support the outer retainer as we're pushing the axle through the bearing and through the retainer. In the video, you're going to see us using all these, and you'll understand 100% how to use them all. With all that said, let's get out to the truck and get started with this job. We've got the rear end jacked up, and we have the axle housing supported in 6-ton jack stands. And then in the front, we have wheel chocks in front of the wheel, because if we didn't have the wheel chocks, the truck would go rolling down the driveway, which would be a bad thing. So now we're going to get the wheels off. So Gleb is going to use a DeWalt impact gun and zip off the lug nuts. So next we want to remove the brake caliper. The first thing we want to do is we want to break free this metal hard line here, and then remove this clip, and then free the soft line, and then we're going to attack the bolts that hold the caliper to the brake backing plate. Gleb is going to use a flex head 10mm flare nut wrench to break free the line, and then once he gets it all the way loose, he's going to cover up the end of the tubing with a 7/32 vacuum cap, so we have minimal loss of brake fluid, so it's going to make the brake bleeding at the end of the job much easier. When Gleb tried to loosen the 10mm flare nut, the whole line was twisting, so now he has another flare nut wrench on the back side. That is a 17mm size, and he's going to hold that firm while breaking free the 10mm. Okay, he's got it broken free, and if he's lucky, he could spin it out with his hands, which it looks like he could spin it out. If not, you might want to switch to a open end 10mm to zip it out the rest of the way. He's slipping over the 7/32 vacuum cap over the flared end of the tubing, and that's going to stop the flow of fluid. Next, we're going to take a little pry bar or a screwdriver and knock that up to where we can remove the soft brake line from the backing plate. Gleb is using a really long flat blade screwdriver. He's getting under the lip of the clip, and he's going to drive up with the ball peen hammer and knock it up. So Gleb and I tag team this because the end of the screwdriver was glancing off the clip, so I stopped filming. I got my hand up here to keep the tip of the screwdriver on the clip while he pounded on the handle with the ball peen hammer, and we were able to get that clip out. So you might need an extra set of hands on this, but that's how we got the clip out. On the soft line side that goes to the caliper, we use a silicone plug to block that off so we don't lose much brake fluid from the caliper. Next, we're going to remove two 17mm bolts that hold the brake caliper assembly to the brake backing plate. There's one there, and then there's one there. And Gleb is going to break those free with a 1/2" ratchet and 17mm socket. Okay, he's got the bottom one loose. Now he's going to get the top one broken free. Okay, he's got both bolts off. He should be able to slide the whole assembly off the rotor. Locked on there, huh?
Yeah, dude.
This brake caliper assembly is really locked onto the rotor for some reason. So we're gonna have to do the extra step of removing the caliper slide pin. So there's a 14mm bolt that screws into the slide pins. Gleb's gonna break those free again with a 1/2" ratchet and socket. So he's working the caliper off of the bracket that houses the pads, and then now we can slide the whole assembly off. So you might find that you have to do the same thing. So you just have to do the extra step of taking out those slide pin bolts so you can separate the caliper from the pad holding bracket. So now we're going to remove the rotor. If your parking brake is adjusted appropriately, you should be able to get the rotor off, but you might not be able to. And if that's the case, then we're going to have to take this access plug out to adjust the parking brake star adjuster to back it off to where we can slide the rotor off of the axle. So let's give it a shot. Good, he was able to get it off. This is what I was talking about with the adjuster. That plug that's in the rotor is an access to be able to get in here with a screwdriver and turn this. So let's figure out which way you'd have to turn it to loosen the brakes. So I would be looking to shorten this distance between here and the adjuster. Gleb is going to use a small pry bar. He's going to turn it one way and see if that gap is getting bigger or smaller. So you'd be coming in with your screwdriver and you have to turn the wheel downward, and that would shorten the distance and bring the shoes in closer together to where you can now slide the rotor off. Since I figure there's a good chance your rotors aren't going to come off like Gleb's did, we're going to show you how to get this plug out. It's just a little rubber plug, and just pry it out, and then we're going to put the rotor back onto the axle and show you the access. With the plug out and the plug basically pointing down at the 6 o'clock position, you come in with a fairly skinny, long flat blade screwdriver, and you have to kind of angle it up, and you have to just kind of go by braille. It's hard to see in there even with the flashlight, and then you can feel the teeth of the star adjuster, and then you grab it and you rotate down. You grab another tooth and you rotate down. You just have to feel for those teeth and work the star adjuster down to where it's fully bottomed out. Then you should have no problem getting that rotor off. And then same goes for when you get it back together. If you want to adjust the parking brake, then you're going to come in here, angle it up, and catch the wheel and turn it up to take slack out to tighten up the parking brake so it holds your vehicle better. That's how you adjust your parking brake, to get it off, and then at the end of the job to get the parking brake properly adjusted at the end of the job. Now we're going to work on disassembling the parking brake system. I'm first going to take out this clip here that holds a pin so we can remove the parking brake cable from the bell crank. It's got a little hook that you got to free. You can see how you have a hook here, and that kind of goes into the hole there. So you pull that outward, and then you can pull the clip out of the pin. And if this isn't rusted, I should be able just to push this out with my hand. Yeah, I can get it out. And then I could just drive it out a little bit more with this or something similar. And so there's the pin. So now this is free. And then just know that there's a metal sleeve in here, and sometimes that will stay on the bell crank, so just don't lose that. Now we're going to work on disconnecting the shoes from the backing plate. The first things I'm going to disconnect are these upper return springs. You'll notice that the front one is painted yellow and the back one just looks black. What I'm going to use to disconnect them is a set of needle nose vice grips. I'm going to grab the spring a little bit back away from the post here, get a good bite on it, and then I'm going to drive the spring this way and unhook it from the post, just like that. You can see where the spring hooks into the shoe. There's a little slot right there, and that's where it hooks in. The short end of the spring hooks into the shoe, and then the long side goes over the center post. I'm going to lay out these parts in the orientation I'm taking them off, so I don't forget what spring goes on what side and the whole 9 yards. So I'm going to basically make a template on this rag to where it's going to jog my memory of how everything goes back together. So same thing, I'm going to grab this spring and then drive forward. And this spring hooks into the front shoe in the same spot. Next, I'm going to disconnect the brake hold down spring assembly. So I have this special tool. You come in, you push in, and then it helps to hold the back of the pin so it doesn't drive this way from the force. And I have to push in and then turn 90 degrees to get the outer plate free. So you can see how it's got a slot. So when it's locked in, the pin is in this orientation. When I push it in and rotate it, then I get it to where the pin will slide through this slot. So you got the outer plate, you got the spring, you have the back plate that has this hook that hooks into the shoe right here. And so I'll just keep all those parts in their orientation. I should be able to rotate this out now. And then you could see this front pin, it has a U bend in it. So you just have to remember that when you put it back together, the U faces the axle. It doesn't go in any other orientation. It goes just like this. So I'm just going to work that back out and pull that out. I'll put everything back together in the orientation it was so I don't forget. Now I could slide this out, and I can't remember what this is called. I think it's called a shoe. Gleb says it's a dog bone. Kind of looks like a dog bone. So just remember the orientation. The longer side faces outward. The spring goes towards the rear of the vehicle, and so that's the correct orientation. The star adjuster might fall out at you at this point, but it goes in this orientation with the side that adjusts facing the rear, and then this has a removable piece right here. So the removable piece goes forward, and then the side that adjusts goes towards the rear. So remember that orientation. I do see some type of return spring here. I'm gonna get that free next. I think I'm just gonna attempt that with needle nose pliers and try to free it of the shoe. Gleb had a good idea. I think I'm just gonna disconnect the hold down spring and then see if I can have an easier time getting this spring disconnected. So again, I'm gonna put my hand on the pin. I'm gonna push in, rotate 90 degrees, and then free it. Same setup with the outer plate, spring, and then inner plate. I'll get the pin out, and I'm just gonna put those parts back together as they were on the truck. Now I'll rotate this down a little bit and see if I can have an easier time getting the spring out. And Gleb was right. See how it hooks right here? It's a full ring. So I could just free it like that and then drop this shoe down. There's one other spring here. It's a return spring for the bottom part. And you can see that it hooks into the backs of the shoes at these spots right here. So I could just slip that out, put that shoe there just like that, and then slip that out. To get the parking brake free of the parking brake lever, I'm gonna grab the spring with the needle nose pliers, pull out, and then at the same time slide the parking brake lever this way on the cable. There we go.
Nice.
So this is the whole assembly. And we are gonna replace these parking brake shoes because they've been infiltrated with gear oil because of the axle seal leak. So we'll show you how to do that later. Next, I'm going to remove the ABS sensor because from experience, when I'm driving in the new seal, the magnet from the sensor is going to kind of mess me up. So I'm going to get it out of the way. It's held onto the axle housing with a 10mm bolt. And then sometimes you can wiggle this out, but oftentimes not. There's a little cutout that you can get in between the sensor and the axle housing, and you can pry with the screwdriver to get it out. There we go. And so there's the ABS sensor. And like I said, this is a magnet, and it will grab the seal when you're trying to install and kind of mess it up. So just get it out of your way. So one thing I want to show you with the ABS sensor out of the way, this is a way that you can see if your axle seals are leaking or not. So you can look in there and see the ABS tone ring. It's got the little raised edges, and that works as a water wheel. As you turn this and you see gear oil lapping up onto that ABS tone ring, you know that the axle seal isn't holding anymore, and it's letting gear oil get past, and then the gear oil will get into the bearing, it will wash the grease out of the bearing, and then you're going to start having big problems. That's one way you can just do it at your house. Jack up the rear end, have the parking brake off, and then take the ABS sensors out, and then use a flashlight, spin the axle while looking in there, and if you see gear oil lapping up on that ABS tone ring, you know you are due for a rear axle seal job and bearings. We're going to drain the gear oil out of the differential now. Technically, you can do this job without doing this if you just jacked up one side at a time. So right now we're working on the passenger side. If we just jacked up the passenger side and left the driver's side wheel on the ground, the axle would be tilted this way, and you could pull the axle out without making a mess of gear oil where you're working. But because we're doing both sides for this job and Gleb's differential gear oil is due to be changed, we're going to drain it. As a precaution, you always want to loosen the fill plug first to make sure after you're done with the job you can actually get gear oil in the differential. It's a 24 millimeter. I'm going to break it free with my 1/2-inch ratchet and a deep 24 millimeter socket. Okay, it's broken free, so I know I can get it out. Now I'm going to switch to the drain plug. Same size, 24 millimeter. And you see that it's kind of glugging out right there. It's because it doesn't have the air it needs to come out smoothly. So as soon as I take the fill plug out, it's going to come out fast, just like that. So we're going to let that drain. Now we're finally ready to remove the axle from the axle housing. The axle is held on to the axle housing with 4 17 millimeter nuts. There's 2 on the top here, and then there's 2 on the bottom. There's 1 here, and then there's another one right here. I'm just using this long 17 millimeter box end from Gear Wrench, and it has a ratcheting side too, which is kind of nice. Now that they're all broken free, I'm just gonna switch to the ratcheting side and get them out. They're pretty much almost on their hand tight. There's no corrosion we're dealing with because we live in the sunny state of California. Okay, that's the last one. This axle should just slide right out. A little bit of gear oil's leaking out, but not much. And there it is. Now with the axle out, we're gonna remove the inner axle seal. To do that, I'm going to use my slide hammer puller set with 2 jaws set up in this fashion to where they can hook the seal and then I can pull it out. It comes from this OTC kit right here, this 9-way slide hammer puller set. It's model number 4579. So I get it in there, and then I turn this to expand the jaws out to where they hook the edges of the seal really solidly. These seals don't have much of a shoulder to them, so I'm hoping I can get a good enough bite on it. Okay, let's give it a shot. There it is. So this is how the tool grabs the seal. You come in narrow, and then you expand it out to where it's locked into the sides, and then you use the slide hammer to drive it out. Now that we have the axle off of the vehicle, we have the axle supported on the brake rotor right here on my workbench. And what we want to determine when we're pressing all the parts on is how far do we drive on the inner retainer and ABS tone ring onto the axle to get a good mating of the inner retainer with the inner axle seal. You can see a witness mark here. That shiny spot is where the seal has been riding on the retainer for hundreds of thousands of miles, and it leaves a mark. That lets us know where the seal is currently riding, and we suspect that this has never been done on this vehicle, but we're not 100% sure. I did watch this other really helpful video. It's made by the Metal Slug YouTube channel. I will link his video in the video description. But what he did is he took a bunch of washers and he stacked up the washers to take up this gap between the ABS tone ring and the outer retainer as a baseline to know how far to press these parts on when you're finishing the press work. So what I'm gonna do is something a little different. I'm gonna take a measurement with the digital calipers in millimeters, and I'm gonna see what that result is. And I'm measuring to the top of the outer retainer, not the snap ring on top of it. And that value is approximately 12.6 millimeters. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna measure 12.6 millimeters on a piece of 3/4 inch PVC pipe. I'm gonna cut it, and then that's gonna be my little tool to see when we're pressing these parts on, how far I need to press them on so I don't go too far and I don't go far enough. So I'm gonna make a mark on here and cut the pipe. So I've made my mark on the pipe, and then hopefully I can make a pretty straight cut. Let's see how I do. So I cut a section off, and we figured out what area of the pipe was a really good fit, because it's hard to get a perfectly straight cut with those PVC pipe cutters. We made a black mark where it fits nice and tight between the ABS tone ring and the outer retainer. So it fits nice and snug. So that's going to be our tool to figure out how far to press these parts on when we're ready to get the new parts on. And then if we just take a measurement with my digital calipers, and you'll see it has the same measurement of 12.6 millimeters. Now what we want to do is we want to be able to pull the ABS tone ring and the inner retainer off the axle shaft. To do that, we have to knock out one of the studs so we can slide in this special tool underneath and then grab it with the main tool and get it on the press and pull these parts off. What you do is you take one of your axle nuts and you screw it onto the stud and just get it level with the end of the stud. And this is just to protect the threads of the stud while you're driving it out with a brass hammer. So I got it pretty level, and I'm just gonna strike it and drive the stud out of the bearing housing. Just like that. Just take the nut off and you can pull the stud out. And you can see what you're overcoming. These are serrations that lock the stud into the bearing case. So now with the stud removed, you can see that I can come in with the tool and get it right underneath the ABS tone ring. Then I grab the main tool and I slide it over the axle. And then I gotta get the nuts and washers on. So I just put a washer and a nut on each one. And you want these nuts screwed on about the same amount on all sides, so the tool is pretty square to the axle. I'm just gonna adjust these to where the tool seems centered on the axle shaft. And they don't have to be cinched down really tight. You could just do it by hand, but just make sure it's centered pretty good on the axle. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So I'm gonna carry this over to the press. Gleb and I are gonna work as a team. We're gonna be on each side of the press so we can lift up the cross member and lower the cross member as a team. You can do it by yourself, but it's just a little bit harder. It's way better with an extra person. I'm gonna get these press plates off of the cross member. We're gonna bring the cross member up higher and then set the pins. And then I'm gonna set the axle underneath. And then we're gonna lower the cross member downward. Start there. So now I have to lift the tool in between the cross member and get it in place. Just like that. So currently I have this screw bar of the 20-ton hydraulic jack screwed out a little bit. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pull down on the springs while Gleb turns the screw bar down into the jack. Okay, that gives us a little bit more room to work. We're gonna come in with our press plates on either side of the tool. So I'm gonna pick up the assembly, and then Gleb is gonna slide the press plates underneath the tool, and I'm gonna have to turn the whole assembly 90 degrees. Just like that. You want to support this tool as best you can with press plates like this, because if you just decided to span the gap of the cross member with Duane's tool, if the parts are really stuck onto the axle and it takes a lot of force, you could technically bend this plate. It's been done by people. So you always want to support the special service tool as close to the spine of the tool as possible to give it the most support possible. So now I'm going to line it up underneath the pressing appendage here. It looks pretty good. I'm gonna lock off the valve. I'm gonna pull this down a little bit, and I'm gonna have Gleb turn the screw bar out just a little bit for me. Okay, so that looks good. I'm gonna go down, and then we're all set. When doing press work, always like double check your work before you start applying a bunch of force. So I'm looking that I'm really square with the pressing appendage. I'm looking underneath, making sure the special tool is nicely underneath the ABS tone ring. All my nuts are in place. And then I have a crash pad underneath here. So when the ABS tone ring and inner retainer break free of the axle, the whole assembly is going to come crashing down, and I don't want to mess up the lug nut studs driving into the concrete. So everything looks good. With doing this type of press work, you're going to feel it load up, and then finally you're going to hear a big twang or bang, letting you know that the parts are now breaking free. So here we go. So that was it, first breaking free, and then now we'll come in for a close-up so you can see the pressing happening. And there it is, it's off. Okay, so you saw the whole axle assembly fall down, letting us know that the ABS tone ring and inner retainer are now free of the axle. I'm gonna twist this, let it fall in between, and then I can just tilt this out. So the ABS tone ring and inner retainer are here, and then I have the rest of the assembly here. Normally when we're doing a job like this, we don't show both sides because it's redundant. All the same press work you do on one side is exactly the same on the other side. With this 100 series Land Cruiser, because the differential is offset, one axle is longer than the other. So the first side we did was the short side, and you can see the difference. This is the passenger side, and then this one's the driver's side. The driver's side is way longer, and it creates a problem of having enough space underneath the cross member to drive out the axle. There's not a whole lot of room. So we built up underneath the tool with as many press plates as we can get in here to where we bring the axle really close to the pressing appendage. There's only like maybe a 1/4 inch left. We're gonna see if we have enough room to pull off the inner retainer and the ABS tone ring with this setup. I've seen the other guy do it on his channel, so I'm assuming you can, but I'm not 100% sure. He had a Harbor Freight press. Maybe he had a different brand. So fingers crossed, we have enough room to drive out the axle. I might actually have to take out my crash pad, but what I'm gonna do is just make it a little bit less tall, so it gives me a little bit more room to drive the axle out. So let's see how this goes. So I got it centered. I'm just gonna get this thing down. Okay, it's locked in, and let's see how it goes. Okay.
Booyah.
It works. So this job, unlike the other rear axle seal jobs we've done on Toyota and Lexus models, you do have to have some more press plates in your pressing arsenal of tools. You can get press plates at a lot of different places. If you have like a fab shop that sells raw steel, you can just tell them, say, hey, I want you to cut me out some plates of different thicknesses. I have 1-inch plates, I have 1/2-inch plates, and so I use every single press plate that I own to build up the assembly to get it closer to the pressing appendage so we can drive it out. I do have links to some press tools, but I think your best bet is to go to some type of fabrication shop that sells steel and then have them use some press plates at different thicknesses so you have a multitude of different ones to use for your press work. So here's the inner retainer, here's the ABS tone ring. You would never want to reuse the inner retainer for 2 reasons. One is, even though it's kind of hard to believe, as the rubber seal is riding on the surface of this retainer for thousands and thousands of miles, it could develop a little bit of a groove. If you reuse it and the new seal is riding in that same groove, then you could get a leak. That's one reason. The other reason is when you pull these parts off, the press work could leave little striations on the inner bore here. And this is also a type of sealing surface. This seals to the smooth part of the axle, so it's a metal to metal seal. And if there's some little striations here, gear oil can get past this connection of the inner retainer with the axle housing. So that's another way gear oil can get past the seal. So it's not always just the seal failing. It could technically get through here. So that's why you always use a new inner retainer. With the ABS tone ring, all this is a hunk of metal that the magnet of the ABS sensor is taking a reading off of. And so this has no sealing quality because the inner retainer is making the seal above it. So you technically could reuse this and save some money. You don't have to buy a new one of these. And then let's come over to the axle. This outer retainer is just a placeholder for the bearing. So the bearing can't slide off of the axle shaft. It's held with a snap ring on top of here. And this is another part you could technically reuse because it has no sealing function either. It's just a placeholder for the bearing. So I'm just letting you know that you could save some money by reusing the ABS tone ring and reusing the outer retainer if you'd like to. So the next step is we're going to get this snap ring off of the axle so we can next press the axle shaft through the outer retainer and through the bearing. So you can see the gap of the snap ring right here. So I got to come in with some snap ring pliers and expand it and get it off. Got it partially out, but one side's stuck in there. There we go. This is something I do not suggest reusing because as you expand it to get it off the axle shaft, you reduce the tension on it and it's not going to hold into the snap ring groove as well. So definitely replace this part. Now that we have the snap ring off, we're going to get this blue adapter plate bolted to the bearing case. With this tool, on one side, you're going to have the bolts going out this way, and the other side, they're going to come out like they are right here. So you can see if I slide this thing over, the studs line up, and I have to draw in this fourth stud. Now let's go over to the other axle and I'll show you the reason why you got to flip the orientation of the studs. This cutoff corner goes towards the bell crank, so if you see when I try to line this up, it doesn't line up. But then if I flip it around, I could see that the studs line up. So I wanted to show that to you also because you have to flip the orientation of the studs for the other side. Next, what you want to do is you want to draw the stud that you knocked out. You want to draw it back in so you have 4 points of contact with this adapter plate. So you just come in from underneath, you fit it in. I like to use a washer and then put the nut on. And then you just simply tighten the 17 millimeter nut and then you draw the serrated part of the stud back in. So I have my little DeWalt impact with a 17 millimeter socket and I'm going to draw it in. There it is. Now we'll get the adapter plate on. And you'll notice that Duane put a sleeve here as a spacer because when you're getting this nut in place, this nut would get in the way of this nut being able to go all the way down. So that's why he puts that spacer there. So now we just got to get the 4 axle nuts installed. To get this one nut in place, we removed the gold nut and we'll get this one in first and then we'll get the gold nut back in place. And you'll notice that these 2 studs have less thread showing than these 2 back 2. It's because there's this part of the parking brake system underneath here. It's this piece right here, and that adds more thickness so the studs don't stick out as far. So that's the reason why you have less thread available on these 2 studs. So now I'll get this gold nut back on, and then I'll slide the main tool over. And you can see because of the one raised nut, because of the spacer, it's a little bit wonky, but as soon as you lock in all the nuts, it won't be wonky anymore. So we've got the tool on there and I just made sure as I tighten the nuts that the tool is fairly in line with the axle housing. It's not 100% perfect, but it's pretty damn in line. And so now we're going to bring this whole assembly over to the press. So we're going to continue showing the long side because that seems to be the more involved side because we have to build up the cross member with a bunch of extra press plates. We have the cross member at the highest point, and I'm going to have to dive the axle in at an angle. He's going to help me. I'm going to get it underneath, and then he can lower it down. And then as a team, we're going to lower the cross member down. Oh no, it's got to go lower, huh? One more. So Gleb and I are going to get the same amount of press plates on either side. So he's going to set them up and get them ready. I'm going to pick up the assembly and he's going to slide them underneath. I think we got to go one less. So we got to take a layer out. Let's take out one of the 1-inch plates. So we're a little bit too high with this setup, so we're going to have to take one of the 1-inch plates out. Haha, that's perfect. So on this one, we're using a 1-inch plate, 1/2-inch plate, and then the 2 press plates that come with the Harbor Freight 20-ton press. I've got to lock off the valve, and then I'm going to use my finger to bring the appendage against the end of the axle. Okay, that's locked in. Now what you're going to want to do is just do a sanity check. Lots of guys have done this job, and the thing that they forget is they forgot to remove that snap ring. And then they start going crazy with the press, loading it up, and nothing's happening, and they're starting to wonder what the hell is going wrong. And it's because they didn't remove that snap ring. And as amazing as it sounds, that little snap ring and the snap ring groove can hold a tremendous amount of force. Do a sanity check, make sure that you did get that snap ring out. So now we're ready to drive the axle free of the outer retainer and free of the bearing. And this is where you might get a lot more fireworks because the bearing is generally really stuck onto the axle. That's a lot of force. Oh my God, that's a lot of force.
There's not something else.
Oh.
There it is.
Woo! Once you've done press work for a while, you kind of know when you're applying a tremendous amount of force, and that was a lot of force. So now it should go easier, in theory. There it is. So the axle drove out of the outer retainer and bearing. So now we're going to work as a team, and we're going to get the press plates out of our way so we can get the axle out of the cross member. So now we have the brake backing plate with the bearing still in here, and we've got the outer retainer in here. And then what's left on this axle, like I knew was going to happen, this is one of the bearing races right here, and it's stuck onto the axle. We have the brake backing plate assembly on my workbench. We disconnected the main tool from the adapter, and then now I'm going to remove the adapter plate. Here is your outer retainer, and then in between the bearing and the outer retainer, I don't know what you call it, a wave washer, but one side is convex, the other side is concave. So the proper orientation of this washer is the concave side faces the bearing, and the convex side that kind of protrudes up faces the outer retainer. And the outer retainer has a bevel, and the bevel faces up, and the flat side faces the washer. And then this one, I have to get the gold nut out of the way. Now what I need to do is I need to drive the 4 bearing housing studs out of the bearing housing so we can free the bearing housing of the brake backing plate, take it over to the press, and drive the bearing out. The bearing is going to come out this direction, so we'll have to drive it through from this direction. So I have the 4 axle nuts onto the studs, level with the end of the stud, and I'm going to drive them out with the brass hammer. There it is. So now that they're driven out, I'm gonna zip off the nuts. And I should be able to just remove this. So now you have your bearing housing with the bearing still installed. And then you have the brake backing plate. And you can see a better look at this piece of the parking brake system. The reason why the studs are shorter, because they have to first go through this. So we have our axle and we have one of the races still stuck on here. The video that I watched from that guy, Heavy Metal Slug, I liked what he did. He pulled off this race and then reinstalled it on top of the bearing to use it as a nice solid platform to drive against, to drive the bearing out of this case. So the next thing I want to do is I want to get another one of Duane's special tools, and I'm going to get it underneath this race, and then we'll pull this off of the axle housing. And then right here, there's a rubber seal that's captured right now, and we'll get that out after we pull the race off. So this is that optional plate you can buy from Duane. I highly recommend it because it makes it easier. You can see how nicely it gets right up underneath the race so you can pull it off. If you decided you didn't want to buy this tool, then what you can do is maybe get some press plates underneath here to capture it, to draw it off. You could also come in with a bearing splitter and grab it. But like I said, if you have a nice special service tool like this, why not? It's a little more money, but I highly recommend it. So slide that underneath, get the main tool slid over, and then we're gonna get the washers and nuts on. All right, we have the main tool body hooked up to the special adapter. We're gonna get this back over to the press. So we're back over to the press. I'm gonna dip the axle underneath, get it centered, and then as a team, we're gonna lower it down again. With this setup, with just the Harbor Freight press plates, you can see that it's too high, and we've got the jack pretty much maxed out. So we got to go down a little bit lower and then build up the assembly with a bunch of plates again. So let's lower it down one notch. And then I'll lift it up, and you got to get press plates underneath there. Okay, we could get more. And it looks like, again, we're going to have to use my full complement of press plates. We're going to have to do 2 1-inch ones, a 1/2-inch one, and then the 2 Harbor Freight press plates. I can't raise it up anymore, it's hitting. Yeah, remove the 1/2-inch. So I take that back. We didn't have enough room between the main tool and the bottom of the cross member to get all the press plates in. This is going to be interesting. There's not a whole lot of space there, but we'll see what happens. We have like, I don't know, 5-6 inches. I'll keep the crash pad there for right now, but I might have to actually remove the crash pad to have enough room. Okay, let's see how it goes. Let me know when it gets really close to the crash pad if I have to pull it out, okay?
Still got about an inch. Okay, getting real close now.
Okay, I am going to have to pull my crash pad out. What I'm going to do is hold pressure here so the studs don't go crashing into the concrete. And you'll see that this little cross member here might get in the way. I might have to back off the press if the studs come close, but let's see how it goes. Oh shit, man. I'm gonna back off just a little bit and twist the assembly. I'm gonna get that stud away more. Okay, that gives us a little more room. So I saw that one of the studs was getting close to this cross member, so I stopped pressing, twisted the assembly to where the studs are gonna clear this cross member. Oh, just enough, man. Oh my God. I think that's it. Yeah, that's it. It doesn't get any closer than that. The only thing I could think of is we could have raised up the whole press off the ground with putting some blocks underneath there. And I do have a couple blocks. I could have done that, but we just barely cleared the garage floor. We got the race that was stuck onto the axle off, and then now we're gonna place it right in here, and then we're gonna press against that to drive the bearing out of the bearing case. This is that seal that I was mentioning. So don't forget to take this out. What this seal does is it directs oil that gets past the inner axle seal and then gets into the bearing, goes through the bearing, and then this seal directs the gear oil into an oil slinger. That's what this metal thing is. And what it does is it directs the oil out a hole in the axle flange face, and this hole in the axle flange face mates up with a hole in the rotor. And the design of this is so if the seal leaks, it's going to direct the oil outside of the wheel and keep the brakes uncontaminated for a while. It's not a perfect engineered thing because gear oil will eventually get into the parking brake shoes, but that's how this thing has been designed by the Toyota engineers. So a little bit of Toyota engineering know-how that I shared with you. And if you look in here, I don't know if the camera will show it, but you can look down in there and see the hole. See that hole that I'm hitting with my screwdriver? That's where the oil is directed outside the axle flange face. So what I have here is two pieces from a big press sleeve kit. This is a driver puck, and this is one of the sleeves. And I chose a sleeve that fit that bearing race really well. It fit the full diameter. I'm gonna be pressing down against the driver puck and the sleeve, and it's gonna drive the bearing out. I had to have these Harbor Freight 20-ton press plates a little bit separated because you have to have a clear path for the bearing to drive out. If the press plate gets in the way, then as soon as the bearing drives out a little bit and hits the press plate, it's going to stop. So you have to have it wide enough to where it's capturing the bearing case really well to support the assembly, but not so far in that it impedes the bearing coming out of the bearing case. So what I did is I got underneath here like this, and with a headlamp, I'm looking to see that the bearing can come out not being obstructed by the press plate, and it looks pretty good. So now we're ready to start driving the bearing out of the bearing case. This is kind of funny, but watching the heavy Metal Slug video, it looked like it took a lot of force, but look what I'm able to do with just my finger. I'm driving the bearing out. So from his video, it looked like this was more of a press fit, but it doesn't seem to be. And this is kind of what I've seen with other Toyota and Lexus rear axles, is that the bearing connection to the bearing case isn't a really tight press fit. Look at that. I'm just using my finger, the one I pick my nose with. And there's the bearing out. And you can see that this bearing is unique because it has two bearing races. It has an inner and an outer bearing race. So what you saw when we did the press work, one of them invariably gets stuck onto the axle, and then you have to draw it off with a special tool. So there it is there. Now what we're going to do is we're going to clean up all the parts really well with some brake cleaner and some brushes, because he did have a leaking axle seal. So his brake backing plate is really dirty. The bearing case is dirty. So we're going to spend a little time doing a little cleanup so we do a nice professional looking job. This is the end of part one. Join us in part two, where we put all the new parts back onto the axle, get the axle back on the truck, get the parking brake put back together, get the disc brake caliper put back on, wheels on, the brakes bled, the differential filled up with gear oil, and we'll be all done. See you in part two.